All right, those are live visuals coming through. We've seen ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa launching the party's Letsima campaign, which was taking place in the Free State today. The campaign, as we heard from the president's address, aims to renew the ANC social contract with its voters, getting party members and local volunteers to address some of the challenges that are being faced in the community there. Again, President Cyril Ramaphosa engaging with residents as part of the campaign amongst some of the events that have been highlighted on the program to date. Let's take a quick ad break, leave it there and continue with more news on the other side. You're watching The Week in Review. All right, welcome back. This is The Week in Review with myself, Liezle Wilson. Let's get straight into it. Consumers' spending power remains under pressure as inflation continues to rise locally and in the global economy. Our figures released by Statistics South Africa showed that the annual consumer price inflation rate increased from 5.7% in February to 5.9% in March of 2022. Analysts say inflation is expected to continue its upward trajectory due to supply-side constraints on the back of geopolitical tensions, obviously occurring in Eastern Europe at this point. But perhaps for more, we're joined by Chief Economist at Econometrics, Dr. Azar Jamin, for more on this analysis. A very good afternoon to you. Thank you for joining us here on the SABC.
Good afternoon to you and your viewers.
Dr. Azar, let's jump straight into it. On Wednesday, it was obviously announced that South Africa's consumer price inflation rate rose to 5.9% in March from 5.7% in February. Can you help us understand and make sense of this? What exactly does it mean for the ordinary consumer?
What it means for the ordinary consumer is the rate at which prices are increasing accelerated, which means that if ordinary consumers, and most of them are in that position, have a fixed salary, it means that that fixed salary will go less of the way towards being able to afford whatever goods and services those consumers want to buy. But of course, an increase from 5.7 to 5.9% is actually only marginal, but it does suggest that disposable incomes are coming under increasing pressure as a result of an acceleration in prices. And the main factor that contributed towards this increase of 0.2% in the inflation rate was the fact that fuel prices shot up sharply in March compared with February. And that is obviously the manner in which consumers will have seen their ability to spend being eroded, because now they have to spend more on petrol or diesel than they previously did and have less available to spend on everything else.
Well, you speak about it only being marginal this time round, but it also marks the 10th consecutive month in which annual inflation in Africa's most developed economy has been higher than the midpoint of the central bank's target range of between 3% and 6%. Help us make sense of that as well in relation to the country at large.
Yes, just to put it into perspective, the increase in our inflation rate to 5.9% is actually quite mild compared with the increases in inflation that have been seen in the likes of the United States or Europe. In the US, the inflation rate went up to 8.5%, and in Europe, it's 7.5% and going up more strongly. So for the first time in the better part of 20, 30 years, our inflation rate, or the rate at which prices are increasing in South Africa, is actually slower than it is in many of the leading countries. And the factors that are contributing towards this inflation increasing, both in South Africa and overseas, are very much the same. And that is higher crude oil prices. You say for 10 consecutive months. Well, oil prices have been rising sharply for the last 10 months or so. Mainly as a result of insufficient new supplies of oil coming on stream, and of course exacerbated in recent months by the sanctions imposed on Russian oil by many countries, including the United States, which is exacerbating the situation. And the fear is that sanctions are going to be intensified on Russia to eliminate that source of supply onto the global market. And, unless others come on stream to supply that oil, we're going to run into difficulty. But it's not just fuel that is the big problem. Allied to oil, prices of things like gas, natural gas, and coal have also been surging ahead. It's quite clear that in the fight towards a greener and cleaner world economy, investors have been reluctant to invest into new coal or gas ventures the way they ought to have been doing. So there's now a limited supply because we haven't moved completely into renewables yet, and it's going to take decades to do so. And then in the interim, we now have a shortage of coal and gas, natural gas. The other point to make is it's not confined to them alone. There's been a general disruption in the supply of all sorts of inputs into production processes as a result of lockdowns imposed in many countries to fight COVID-19, the most important being, of course, Chinese lockdowns. And there are shortages of all sorts of inputs, such as pewter chips. That's one of the big and highly relevant ones. And in some of the commodities that are needed to supply batteries that are needed for, non-fuel linked energy sources. And then over and above that, the war in the Ukraine has rapidly exacerbated fears about shortages of food commodities, especially wheat and sunflower oil or cooking oil, and their prices have been screaming upwards in tandem with a big increase in the cost of fertilizers as a result of fears of shortages emanating from sanctions being imposed on Russia and Belarus on their production of or supply of potash and nitrogen and such like inputs going into fertilizers. So the cost of producing food especially in the African continent is likely to be very, very heavy. South Africa is, funnily enough, relatively insulated because we are largely self-sufficient in food supply. It's quite a miracle given the reduction in the number of farmers in the country, but the country's agricultural sector has been one of the areas of great success in the past decade or two.
Dr. Zhao, with South Africa's rand, having been amongst the best performing currencies in the world this year, I mean, obviously there's a number of factors, but thanks to metal exports amongst other factors. But, we also saw that this week it fell by 7% in the wake of the floods and perhaps the issue of severe power cuts that have also, long held back the country's economy. Talk to us about those factors this week alone.
Yes, I mean, there are international factors also linked to global monetary policy that suddenly started impacting negatively on the rand. The possibility that the Americans and other industrialized countries are going to raise interest rates very steeply. So, for quite a while now, there's been a big attraction in terms of buying the rand and South African government bonds because of the high interest rate available on those relative to the virtual zero interest rates in industrialized countries. Now that is turning. Those zero interest rates are going to move to 2, 3, 4% in some of these countries. And so the attractions of buying into the rand to get 8 or 9 or 10% are now going to diminish. Secondly, we noticed that Anglo-American reported, for example, that as nice as all these high metal prices have been, production by Anglo's mines, be it copper, iron ore, platinum group metals, have all been suffering badly as a result of the heavy rains in those mining areas and the difficulty in extracting the ore out of the ground and raising the costs of extracting that. So we have sent the message that we're unable to take full advantage of the rise in those commodity prices. On top of that, we had the increased intensification of load shedding, especially to stage 4, and the suggestion that this is going to carry on for another 100 days, especially in now winter season when there's a big demand for heating fuel. That has scared people about economic growth prospects in South Africa. On top of that, we had the KwaZulu-Natal floods and the need for the government to step in with a whole lot of relief measures. How are they going to afford that? It means a further increase in our budget deficit and public debt, which is obviously negative for the markets. And then over and above all that, we had there are signs now that COVID-19 is starting to pick up quite sharply again,
Yes.
which means new prospects of restrictions, or prospects of renewed restrictions being imposed, all of which spells negativity for South Africa's economic growth prospects, and with that, the ability to raise enough tax revenue to reduce the budget deficit and our public debt. And the combination of all these factors weighed heavily on the rand. As to why it took place it was quite a sudden turnaround, and that's the vagaries of markets. You probably had some of these players who were big buyers of the rand suddenly saying, no, it's all over now, let's get out. And so that exacerbated the magnitude of the decline.
Well, Dr. Azar, just in the interest of time, as we conclude the conversation, I just want to also quickly look at the South African Reserve Bank set to raise, by another 75 basis points this year. Perhaps what this means for the ordinary South African who is already struggling financially. Looking at the Reserve Bank expected to lift the repo rate by 25 basis points in May and 50 basis points come Q3.
Yes, by the way, the additional reason why the rand may have fallen is because the CPI inflation rate that we started this discussion with went up from 5.7 to 5.9%. People expected it to be 6% or more. So that diffused some of the fears that some people have been talking about, the Reserve Bank raising the repo rate by 50 basis points in May. And this lower inflation rate than expected diffused that expectation, which meant less of an attraction to buy rands for high interest rates. So get out of the rand. But clearly the impact on consumers is going to be negative. Having said that, I think it's important to put it into perspective. The repo rate when we went into COVID was 10%. The repo rate currently is 7.75%. And even if it goes up by another 75 basis points, we'll still be at 8.5%. So in other words, still 1.5% below where it was at the time that COVID began. So yes, it's going to squeeze those with debt, but just bear in mind that it's nowhere near as bad a situation as prevailed prior to the onset of COVID-19. Unfortunately, that is also, and the fact our ability to keep inflation lower than many other countries is also a function of the fact that South African consumers are under strain because the economy is just not growing fast enough. And one can attribute that to a whole lot of factors, but many of them are structural that have been with us for over a decade. And until such time as the government succeeds in addressing those structural impediments, consumers are going to be under pressure and stay under pressure, and employment will be in jeopardy.
Thank you very much for joining us here on the SABC today, Dr. Azar. Again, giving us some analysis. We saw that consumer spending power remains slightly under pressure as inflation continues to rise locally and in the global economy. But according to figures released by Stats SA showing that the annual consumer price inflation rate increased from 5.7 to 5.9% in March of 2022. Dr. Azar Jamin, the chief economist at Econometrics, giving us analysis, perhaps helping us make sense of what those numbers entail, what they mean for the South African at large. Again, thank you very much for your time. As we continue to take a look at more news, we've seen the IMF or World Bank meetings were eventful this past week. And while they tackled a number of global agendas, the Russia-Ukraine war was in the foreground of talks, with Western nations continuing to pledge their solidarity with the Ukraine and promising the country continued military and financial support. While a group of high-profile ministers from the United States, the UK and Canada were among some who walked out of the talks, where a Russian representative was speaking at the time. And the ongoing conflict was blamed by the IMF for a downward revision in global growth for this year. Take a look.
The Russia-Ukraine war was a constant shadow in global discussions at this year's IMF World Bank spring meetings. Due to a lack of consensus on a number of issues, the traditional joint communiqué, usually sent out after these meetings, didn't happen. Even the G20 meeting, of which Russia was a part, which happened on the sidelines of the IMF, could not issue a joint communiqué. But there were discussions about the future of the IMF and World Bank organizations in a changing world. US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen joined a band of progressives calling for major reforms at the institutions, adding that they were never designed to deal with the multiple challenges the world now faces.
We face challenges that require investment on a scale that an international institution can't manage on its own, like climate change. And the investments needed for climate change will add up to just trillions and trillions of dollars.
Other major issues facing the world, like the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, higher inflation and emerging countries' susceptibility to falling into a debt trap, were also high on the agenda. IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva spoke to these issues.
First, end the war in Ukraine. Second, continue to confront the pandemic with a comprehensive toolkit that includes vaccines, testing and antiviral treatments deployed everywhere. Third, tackle inflation and debt. Central banks should act decisively and communicate clearly. Spending must be carefully prioritized and targeted. Some countries will require debt restructuring. To help them, the G20 common framework must be improved.
And during the week, the IMF released its World Economic Outlook report. It forecast global economic growth to slow to 3.6% in 2022, compared to its earlier estimate of 4.1%, blaming the Russia-Ukraine war for curbing growth and inflaming inflation even further. Nompumelelo Siziba, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Well, food processing giant Enterprise is shutting down most of its operations at Polokwane in Limpopo. It has permanently closed its plant where food items such as polony and Viennas are produced. Country Bird Holdings, the company which owns Enterprise, says it will, however, retain about 50 employees to run operations at its canning business. The factory has struggled to recover losses incurred in 2017 when traces of listeriosis were detected at its plants in Polokwane and Germiston.
The Enterprise factory has scaled down operations. The production of processed food has completely ceased, leaving the factory to only focus on the production of canned food. Its new management says it was no longer financially viable to continue with operations in full.
It was an extremely difficult decision to close the plant and wasn't made lightly at all. We understand the community's concerns. However, we've done all we could to prevent the full closure of the facility. And as things stand at the moment, 50 staff will be retained to continue operating our canning operations.
Hundreds of employees affiliated to labor unions in the food processing industry have been served with retrenchment notices.
Enterprise, as the employer, ran to CCMA to say, CCMA, can you grant us a retrenchment certificate? We even told the commissioner there to say, Commissioner, we cannot allow a situation where the employer can avoid coming to the table. But because you know that ordinarily those are process matters that even if we can argue, the commissioner must at a certain particular time give a ruling.
Following the acquisition of the company from its original owners, Tiger Brands, its new management, Country Bird Holdings, encountered challenges largely due to market stagnation. The company had already been battered following the outbreak of listeriosis between 2017 and 2018.
It's going to be tough for us because our families and our businesses depend on Enterprise products, and the workers from Enterprise, how are they going to live if they are going to be retrenched?
Enterprise employees stopped reporting for work at the beginning of April. Only 50 employees are on duty at the food canning plant. It is unclear how the current situation will impact its retail store. Katle Khonyoni, SABC News, Polokwane.
Right, let's take a quick ad break. We continue with more news and updates on the other side. You're watching The Week in Review with myself, Liezle Wilson. All right, welcome back. And more news at this hour. The long-awaited ANC elective conference in the Eastern Cape is set to take place on the 6th to the 8th of May. The party says it has declared that of 91% of branches are in good standing to hold the conference, which has met 70% of the threshold for the conference to in fact sit. The party has further completed the 160 disputes which were lodged by branches. The conference is expected to host 1,500 voting delegates and 200 non-voting. The party's provincial coordinator Lulama Ngugaitobi says they have beefed up security measures.
So 160 disputes were lodged with the Provincial Dispute Resolutions Committee, and of yesterday, they have completed all of them except only 2, which will be completed by today. And some branches decided to escalate their appeals beyond the Provincial Dispute Resolutions Committee to the National Dispute Resolutions Committee. And of that 160 that was done, only 50 that were escalated. And as of 2 days ago, the National Dispute Resolution Committee had already concluded 30, and there were only 20 outstanding. I am certain that as per the letter from the acting SG, that particular matter would be completed as a matter of urgency. Now, as we have been interacting with the National Office, Secretary's Office, Secretary General's Office, insofar as our state of readiness, we are all convinced that we are ready for the conference, except conclusion of these matters that relates to the dispute resolutions mechanism. Now that matter is going to be completed. The National advised us that we should go for our conference as of the 1st of the 28th of April, this month, to the 1st of May. But unfortunately, because of logistical incapabilities, the non-availability of venues for the capacity of 1,500 strong men and women and people of other genders to be assembled under one roof, under the name of the African National Congress in the Eastern Cape. So we could only get one venue, unfortunately, and that venue could only allow us for those particular days of the 6th to the 8th. And therefore, we had to go back to the Office of the Secretary General, advise us of the decision of the Provincial Task Team as of yesterday, as the one that is a custodian, anyway, of convening its own provincial conference. Now, we are here, therefore, to communicate that we are ready.
Meanwhile, former President Kgalema Motlanthe says government communicator Thabo Masebe is a real product and creative history within the ANC. He has paid tribute to the late Acting Director General in the office of the Premier of Gauteng, David Makura, at his funeral service underway at the Kempton Park Civic Theatre in Ekurhuleni. Masebe died on Monday at the age of 58 years old. Motlanthe says it was for the generation of Masebe that the young people of this country are now enjoying the fruits of democracy.
To his family, we would like to express immense gratitude for sharing Comrade Thabo Masebe with us in his extended family, the African National Congress. Even though we may not fully grasp the gravity of your deep sorrow and loss, we hope that you find solace and comfort in the knowledge that we are here to condole with you. Your loss is our loss. All the tributes since his passing have been a positive reflection, underpinned by profound affection for the memory of Comrade Thabo. I've been asked to add our voice in paying tribute to this distinguished cadre of our organization. As Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. said, and I quote, When we were young, our hearts were filled with fire. And as life is action and passion, a man must share in the actions and passions of his time at the risk of being judged not to have lived at all, close quote. Like many of his comrades and like all of us, Comrade Thabo is at once a product and a creator of history. Comrade Thabo, though self-effacing, his heart was filled with fire and shared in the actions and passions of his time. He distinguished himself in the role that he played, first as a student and a youth activist in the turbulent 1980s and early 1990s.
Well, that's where we're going to leave it for you today. We'll be back tomorrow for a look at the week ahead. From myself, Liezle Wilson, and the team. Until tomorrow, do take care. It's goodbye for now.